So we just talked about web programming, talked a little bit about ASP.NET Core. And now we're going to talk a little more specifically about how MVC fits into all of this. So MVC is considered an architectural framework. It's a pattern that separates an application into three main components. The M in MVC stands for model. And the model is basically a set of classes that describe the data that you are working with. And the classes include the business rules for how the data can be changed or manipulated. The view, which is the V in MVC, is basically the user interface or the UI. That is what the client sees. It's actually the only part that they can see. And the controller are the classes that handle the communication from the user, the flow of the application, and there is application-specific logic. So the controller basically makes a lot of decisions. It will decide what kind of data has to be retrieved. It will decide what kind of data has to be passed on to the view and displayed to the user. It will decide whether a database update needs to be made. So the controller handles a lot of behind-the-scenes work. So in the MVC model, this graphic kind of shows you how the three components, the model, view, and controller, work together. So you've got a web browser that makes a request. That request goes to the controller. The controller then checks the model. If it needs to retrieve data, it does. And it interfaces with your database server. And any data that it needs to retrieve is then brought back into the controller. The controller then determines which pieces of data need to go onto the view. The view is then displayed to the user. Okay, so that's how it works. Now, MVC is called a pattern because the framework is a method of designing applications. And we're going to be using it with ASP.NET Core, but you can actually apply this pattern to many different languages. You don't have to use ASP.NET Core. Okay, so MVC is a pattern that we are going to be using. It fits really well with web applications, which is part of the reason that we are using it. Using ASP.NET Core with MVC lets you generate your web apps really quick. The MVC architecture has kind of evolved out of a previous architecture called Thing Model View Editor. That's been around since 1979. The reason that the MVC pattern works really well for web applications is because it follows our web standards of progressive enhancement, which involve separating the concerns. So we've got our structure, which is our HTML, separate from the appearance, which is our CSS, separate from the behavior, which is the JavaScript. So MVC actually kind of follows that because we've got our data, which is our model, separate from our view, which is our UI, which is separate from the controller, which is handling all sorts of communication behind the scenes. And our user is really only interacting with the view and the controller. User requests go to the controller, okay? And the view is displayed to the user. Now, the user cannot directly key in the address of a view. The only thing the user can go to directly is the controller. So the controller is the entry point for the user command, period. That's a little different than what we're used to when we're dealing with web pages. We're used to keying in a web address and seeing the UI, right? That's basically what we do when we key in a web page. In MVC, you cannot directly get to the views. You can only go to the controller, which then selects the correct view and displays it. So when we get to models, you will see that a model is simply a class. And you guys have all been working with classes, so I don't think you're going to have any problems creating models. When we get to the interfacing with the database, we are going to be using Entity Framework Core. So we will have something called a data access layer that kind of connects our model classes to the database. And a view, again, is our user interface. We are going to be using HTML, but it's kind of special HTML that will allow for some Razor code, which is basically C# code, embedded into the HTML. And then the controller is pretty much straight C#. Okay, so you'll see a lot in the controller that makes sense to you. As far as benefits and features of MVC, one of the main benefits is that it's open source. It's also extensible, which means it's not dependent on ASP.NET Core. Our views that we create are going to be CS HTML files. So that stands for C# HTML, but you could have straight HTML files in your views. You could display JavaScript. You can display all sorts of different things. So that's what we mean by extensible. The MVC framework that we are using incorporates minification. And basically it combines individual scripts into a single request. Okay, so it kind of shortens things and simplifies it. Also, it uses scaffolding, which you guys are going to love, because scaffolding basically generates code for you. So it's less typing, and we're going to let the system do a lot of the work for us. So benefits of MVC. It's a little easier to have a team working on an application because you can have different people working on the different components. It's also possible to automate testing of individual components. And because we have the components, you can easily swap out one component for another. And this all makes your application easier to maintain. The primary disadvantage is the time it takes to set everything up. And I don't think it'll take you all that long once you understand everything. To me, getting to that level of understanding how everything works is the time-consuming part. Because if you start making a bunch of changes and you don't understand how one change affects something else, you're going to break your app and then it's hard to fix it. So I think the time involved in learning everything is the disadvantage, but once you know it, you can quickly develop apps. So if you're wondering, how does ASP.NET Core relate to ASP.NET, web forms, and some of the other things that you've been working with? So I included this little graphic to kind of show you how they are related. So we're over here on this ASP.NET Core side, which means that we're going to be cross-platform. The web forms, the traditional ASP.NET, the older version of MVC that we used to use, all had to run in a Windows environment. With .NET Core, that's no longer true.